The autumn Wren Costello turned 12. She was told there was no more room for her firewood. Not unkindly. Not even with much thought behind it. Her Uncle Dale simply needed the east bay of the family woodshed for his splitter and his own cordwood. And since Wren's stack was the smallest and the newest, it was the one that got moved out into the open yard, stacked against the fence line under a blue tarp that flapped every time the wind came down off the ridge. Nobody meant any harm by it. That was the strange part. It was just how things worked on a shared homestead where 3 generations of Costellos lived within shouting distance of each other, and the woodshed had always belonged to whoever needed it most that year. Wren had needed it least. She was 12. She didn't have a wood stove of her own, not really. She just liked to keep a supply going for her grandmother's cabin, the little one-room place at the back of the property where her grandmother, Edette, had lived alone since Wren's grandfather passed. She remembered the exact morning it happened, a Tuesday in late September, cool enough that her breath showed when she walked out to check on her stack before school. Dale was already out there with a tape measure, marking off the east bay with a piece of chalk, and he'd looked up at her with the mildly apologetic expression of a grown man who has already decided something and is now working out how to tell a child about it without making a production of it. He'd explained about the splitter, about needing the space for his own wood, about how her stack was small enough to move without much trouble. He'd offered to help her carry it out to the fence line himself, and he had, hauling armloads out into the yard while she held the tarp corners down against the wind. It wasn't a cruel moment. It was, if anything, a perfectly reasonable one. The kind of small reshuffling that happens constantly in a household where resources get divided up according to who needs them most. But Wren had stood at the fence line afterward, looking at her own small stack sitting exposed under a tarp that was already fighting the wind, and felt something settle in her chest that was quieter than anger and harder to shake. It wasn't that she'd been wronged. It was that she'd been overlooked. In the particular way a child's needs get overlooked when they're smaller and quieter than everyone else's. Edette was 79 and stubborn about her independence, and she burned through nearly a full cord of wood every winter, keeping that cabin warm. She'd turned down every offer to move into the main house, every suggestion that she install a propane furnace like the rest of the family had, and every gentle hint that maybe, at her age, hauling wood and tending a stove was more than she needed to manage alone. She liked her stove. She liked the particular kind of heat it made, dry and even, working its way into the corners of a small room in a way she said no furnace ever quite managed. She'd lived in that cabin for more than 50 years, and she intended to keep living in it exactly the way she always had, wood heat and all, for as long as her legs would carry a stove log across the floor. The rest of the family had come to accept this the way you accept weather, something to plan around rather than argue with. And it was Wren, more than anyone else, who had taken it upon herself to make sure that plan actually held together each winter. Wren had taken it upon herself, 2 years running, to make sure her grandmother never ran low. She split kindling on weekends. She hauled rounds in a wagon. She learned, slowly, and without anyone teaching her directly, which logs caught fast and which ones smoked and sulked in the stove for an hour before doing anything useful. So when Dale needed the space and her stack got moved to the fence line, Wren didn't argue. She just watched the blue tarp for 2 weeks. Watched how the wind kept working it loose at the corners, watched how condensation gathered underneath it on cold mornings and dripped straight down onto the wood she'd worked all summer to split. And she understood, in the plain and unsentimental way children sometimes understand things before adults do, that a tarp on the ground was not going to get her grandmother through January. She didn't say any of this out loud. She wasn't a child who complained. She was a child who solved. By the first week of October, with frost already silvering the grass some mornings, and the maples gone from green to rust in what felt like a single weekend, Wren started disappearing into the tree line behind the cabin for a few hours every afternoon. Her mother assumed she was building a fort. Her father assumed she was avoiding chores, which annoyed him until he noticed she was doing her chores fine and then some. Idette, who missed very little, noticed that her granddaughter had started asking odd questions. "How long does it take green wood to season, Grandma? Does wood dry faster off the ground or on it? Why does the wood in the shed always burn better than the wood we cut this spring?" Idette answered what she could. She'd grown up burning wood because there was no other choice, back before the county ran gas lines out that far. And she still remembered things her own father had taught her about seasoning cordwood the old way, back when a woodshed wasn't a convenience, but a matter of whether your family stayed warm or didn't. She told Wren that wood needs air moving through it more than it needs shelter from rain, that a woodpile can survive getting rained on if it can also dry out afterward, but a woodpile that stays wet and still, with no air passing through it, will mold and rot, and refuse to burn clean no matter how long you wait. She told her that green wood holds water inside its cells, sometimes close to half its weight in moisture, and that water has to leave before the wood will burn properly, because a fire has to boil that water off before it can do anything else, which is why wet wood hisses and smokes and throws off more creosote than heat. She told her that a woodshed needs a roof to keep rain and snow from falling straight down onto the stack, but it needs open sides to let wind move through, because without wind, the moisture that rises out of drying wood just sits there in the air around it and never actually leaves. Wren listened to every word the way she listened to Clifton the extension man when he came out to help with the garden, taking it in like it belonged to her now, hers to use. By the middle of October, Wren had picked her spot. It wasn't near the house. It wasn't near the main woodshed, where Dale's splitter now sat surrounded by his own neatly stacked rows. She'd found a shelf of higher ground about 200 yards into the trees behind Idette's cabin, a spot where an old fallen oak had cleared a gap in the canopy years before Wren was born, letting afternoon sun pour through in a way it didn't anywhere else on that stretch of hillside. The ground there sat slightly higher than the surrounding forest floor, sloped just enough that rainwater ran off instead of pooling, and it faced south and west, catching sun for most of the day and taking the worst of the wind off its shoulder rather than head-on. It was, without Wren having any name for it, almost exactly the kind of site an old-timer would have chosen for a woodshed 100 years earlier, back before anyone built one without thinking hard about where the sun fell and which way the weather came from. She didn't tell her parents what she was building. She didn't tell Dale. She especially didn't tell her older brother, Cassidy, who had taken to calling her project Wren's Fort, in the particular tone of a 15-year-old who has decided something is beneath his attention. She told only Idette, and only because Idette had a way of finding things out anyway, and because Wren needed her grandmother's old pamphlets, the same yellowed stack of agricultural extension bulletins Idette kept in a drawer beside her rocking chair, dating back to a decade before Wren's mother was even born. One of them, water-stained and dog-eared at the corner, was titled simply Farm Woodlot Management and Fuel Storage. Wren read it twice through by flashlight in the cabin's back room, while her grandmother dozed in her chair by the stove. What she built that fall was not fancy. It was a child's version of a design meant for grown men with lumber trucks and post-hole diggers, built instead with what she could scavenge, trade for, or beg off her father a few boards at a time without him asking too many questions. She started with 4 corner posts, black locust rounds her father had cut 2 winters back and never split because locust splits meaner than almost any other wood in the county. Locust doesn't rot in the ground the way pine or poplar will. Old-timers used it for fence posts because a locust post could sit in wet dirt for 30 years and still hold. Wren didn't know the chemistry behind it, only that Edette had told her locust posts outlast the fences built around them, and that was reason enough to spend a whole Saturday sinking 4 of them into the ground with a post-hole digger nearly as tall as she was. She set the posts so the floor of the shed would sit 16 inches off the ground, high enough that no rain could splash up into the stack, high enough that mice and voles couldn't burrow a den underneath the wood and chew through it over winter, and high enough that air could move freely under the whole pile instead of just around its edges. For the floor itself, she used pallets she'd hauled out of the feed store in town after asking the manager if she could have the broken ones stacked behind the loading dock. He'd looked at her for a long moment, the way adults sometimes look at children whose requests don't quite make sense to them, and then said, "Sure. Kid, take as many as you want. They're just taking up space." She laid the pallets across the locust frame, gaps and all. Because the gaps were the point. Air needed to come up through the bottom of the stack the same way it needed to move through the sides. For the roof, she used tin she traded for, 3 sheets of old barn roofing. Wendell Pruitt had stripped off his equipment shed the summer before when he re-roofed it, sheets he'd been meaning to haul to the scrapyard for 2 years and never had. Wendell was in his 70s, retired from dairy farming, and he had a soft spot for kids who showed up asking serious questions about serious things. When Wren knocked on his door and asked whether he had any old roofing tin he wasn't using, and could she trade some split kindling for it, he laughed for the first time in the conversation and told her to just take it. He didn't need kindling that badly, but he'd take a jar of her grandmother's blackberry preserves if she had one to spare. She pitched the roof steep, steeper than felt necessary at first glance, because Edette had told her that a flat roof lets snow sit and lets meltwater find its way through every seam eventually, while a steep pitch sheds snow before it has the chance to melt and seep. She built the roof to overhang the walls by more than a foot on every side, so that wind-driven rain couldn't blow in sideways and reach the stacked wood beneath, a detail she'd copied almost exactly from a diagram in Edette's old bulletin, showing what it called a proper lean-to woodshed, the kind farm families built before anyone had electricity or gas heat, and a wet woodpile could mean a genuinely hard winter. She left the 2 long sides of the shed almost entirely open, just a single crossbeam at waist height on each side to keep the wood from sliding out, because the entire structure was useless if it couldn't breathe. A closed shed, she'd read, could be worse than no shed at all, trapping moisture that rose out of the wood and never letting it escape, turning what should have been a drying space into a slow, damp incubator for mold and rot. She oriented the whole structure so its open sides ran east to west, catching the prevailing wind that came down the valley from the northwest in winter, letting it sweep straight through the stacked rows rather than deflecting off a solid wall. She didn't have a word for prevailing wind. She just knew, from 2 winters of watching smoke rise off Idette's chimney, which direction the cold air generally came from, and she built her shed to use that wind instead of fight it. The first stack she built inside it, in late October, was wrong, and she knew it within a week. She'd stacked the split logs tight together, bark side up, packed in close the way she'd always seen wood stacked in the old shed, because tight stacking seemed like it ought to be sturdier and neater. But when she checked it after a week of damp weather, the center of the stack felt cool and faintly clammy to the touch, while the outer rows, exposed to moving air, felt dry and light. She pulled the whole stack apart and rebuilt it in narrower rows with gaps between them, no more than 2 logs deep before a gap, so that air could work its way not just around the stack, but through it. She also flipped every log so the bark faced down or to the side rather than straight up, because bark holds moisture against the wood underneath it, sealing water in rather than letting it escape. Something else Idette's bulletin had mentioned in a single line Wren had read maybe 6 times before she understood why it mattered. There was more, too, that she picked up as the weeks went on, small corrections nobody handed her outright, but that she worked out by watching and touching, and sometimes getting it wrong first. She learned that oak took the longest to season of anything she cut, sometimes a full 2 years before it burned clean, and that the rounds her father had split 3 winters back were only now truly ready, dense and heavy for their size, but ringing almost hollow when she knocked 2 pieces together, a sound Idette told her was the surest sign a log had given up its water. Green oak, by contrast, thudded dull and flat when struck, still carrying all the weight of the sap trapped inside it. She learned that ash would burn nearly as well green as seasoned, which was why old-timers prized it so highly, and that pine and other softwoods dried fast but burned fast too, throwing more sparks and building up more creosote in a chimney than the hardwoods did, useful for kindling and quick heat, but not something you wanted carrying you through a whole cold night. She learned to read the ends of a split log the way Idette read them, checking for the fine cracks called checking that spread out from the center as wood dries and loses volume, a small cobweb of splits that told her a log was closer to ready than its outside color alone would suggest. She learned, too, that stacking wood the same year it was cut and expecting it to burn well that winter was mostly wishful thinking, that anything cut in summer or fall needed a full season, sometimes 2, before it was truly dry enough to burn efficiently, and that the whole point of a well-built woodshed wasn't really to protect wood that was already dry. It was to finish drying wood that wasn't safely out of the rain, with enough moving air to carry the last of its moisture away before the cold set in and locked whatever water remained inside it. That last point stuck with her more than any other, because it meant the shed itself wasn't just storage, it was a tool, doing a job every single day it stood there, whether anyone was watching it or not. By November, the shed was full, 4 cords of split and stacked wood that Wren had cut, split, hauled, and restacked almost entirely on her own, with her father helping haul the heaviest rounds on 2 Saturdays without ever quite admitting that he was impressed. Harmon Costello was not a man who said much. He watched his daughter work the way he watched weather move in, quietly, taking note, saying little. When she finished the last row and stood back to look at what she'd built, tucked into the trees where nobody but Idette knew to look for it, he stood beside her for a long moment and then asked how much wood that little shed actually held. She told him. He did some rough math in his head and said that was more dry wood than most of the county had put up that year, given how wet the fall had been. Winter came in hard that year, harder than the extension office had predicted. The first real cold snap hit in mid-December, and it was followed almost immediately by 3 days of freezing rain, then a thaw, then another freeze, the kind of weather pattern that farmers in that valley had started calling, only half joking, the ice cream sandwich winter, a hard layer, a soft layer, and another hard layer stacked right on top of each other. It was miserable weather for keeping firewood dry. Tarps that had held fine in October failed under the weight of ice. Open-air stacks along fence lines soaked through during the freezing rain and then froze solid before they had any chance to dry, locking moisture inside the wood instead of letting it escape. By the first week of January, half the wood piles in that end of the county were in trouble, and everyone with a wood stove knew it before anyone said it out loud. Dale's wood, the wood that had displaced Wren's stack from the family shed back in October, had been sitting exposed at the tail end of his row because the shed itself was too full to close properly, and after the freezing rain, it wouldn't catch. He spent 20 minutes one evening trying to get his stove going, watching log after log smolder and hiss and refuse to hold a flame, filling his kitchen with smoke instead of heat, before he gave up and drove over to his mother's cabin to see if Edette had anything dry he could borrow. Edette's stove, of course, was burning fine. It had been burning fine all winter. Word travels slow, and then all at once in a place like that. It was Cassidy, of all people, who first put it together. When he noticed that Edette's cabin was the only place on the whole property that hadn't had a single smoky, sulking fire all winter, and that his little sister had been sneaking off into the trees with an axe and a wagon since October, he followed her out one Saturday in mid-January, half expecting to find nothing more than the fort he'd been teasing her about for months. What he found instead was a shed with a steep tin roof and open sides, tucked into a clearing that caught the last of the afternoon sun. 4 cords of split wood stacked in narrow rows with gaps between them, every log dry to the touch despite 3 weeks of freezing rain and thaw that had ruined half the woodpiles in the valley. He stood there for a while without saying anything, which for Cassidy was itself unusual. And then he asked her, in a voice that had dropped every trace of teasing, how she'd figured out to build it like that. She told him about air, about bark facing down, about gaps between rows, about locust posts that wouldn't rot, and a roof pitched steep enough to shed snow before it melted, about orienting the open sides to catch the wind instead of block it. She told him the way Edette had told her, plainly, like it was just information anyone might want to have, not a secret she'd been protecting. By the end of January, word had reached the rest of the family, and then the neighbors, the way it does in a small enough place. Dale came out to see it himself, a grown man standing quietly in front of a woodshed built by his 12-year-old niece, running his hand along the tin roof, checking the gaps between the stacked rows with the kind of attention he usually reserved for machinery. He didn't say much either, but he asked if she'd help him rebuild his own woodshed before next fall, oriented the same way, raised off the ground the same way, and she said she would. Wendell Pruitt came out too, curious about what had become of his old roofing tin, and stood in front of the little shed for a long time before he said that he'd built plenty of woodsheds in his life, on his own land, and for half the farms in the county besides, and he'd never once seen a 12-year-old get every detail right on the first real attempt, gaps and orientation, and roof pitch and all, working only off an old extension bulletin and her grandmother's memory. By February, when the ice cream sandwich winter had thoroughly wrecked woodpiles up and down the valley, and half the families around were burning through borrowed wood or running their stoves too hot trying to force damp logs to catch, Edette's cabin stayed exactly as warm as it had all winter, and Wren's little hidden shed in the trees still had wood to spare. She started sharing it, a few armloads at a time, with anyone in the family who came up short, which by that point in the season was most of them. The county extension office got wind of it by way of Wendell, who mentioned it almost in passing to the forestry agent who came out every few years to look at the family's woodlot and advise on which trees to thin. The agent, a soft-spoken man named Garrett Voss, who had spent 20 years walking other people's timberland and had grown mostly immune to surprise, drove out on a cold, bright Saturday in late February to see the shed for himself. Mostly, he admitted, because he didn't quite believe what Wendell had told him. He walked the whole structure slowly, the way a man walks something he intends to remember precisely. He crouched to look under the raised floor. He ran a hand along the underside of the tin roof where it overhung the open sides. He pulled 2 logs from the middle of a stack and knocked them together, listening to the same hollow ring Edette had taught Wren to listen for, and he stood there a moment with an expression Wren would later describe to her mother as a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking how it came out. He asked her where she had learned to orient the open sides to the prevailing wind instead of blocking it, and she told him about watching smoke rise off her grandmother's chimney for 2 winters running. He asked where she'd learned about locust posts resisting rot in wet ground, and she told him that was just something her grandmother always said, the way you'd say water runs downhill. He asked about the roof pitch and the raised floor and the gaps between rows, and each time her answer came back to the same 2 sources, an old bulletin from a drawer and a woman who had been paying attention to wood and weather for the better part of 8 decades. Garrett Voss had spent much of his career trying to convince farm families to build exactly this kind of structure, with limited success, because a proper woodshed took real thought and real labor to build correctly, and most people, understandably, just wanted somewhere to stack their wood before winter arrived, and didn't think much further than that. He told Wren, standing there in the cold with his notebook half filled with measurements he'd taken without quite meaning to, that in 20 years of driving out to farms across 3 counties, he had never once found a woodshed built this precisely by an adult on the first attempt. Heights, let alone a child working from an old pamphlet and her grandmother's memory. He asked if he could bring photographs back to the office and whether the extension service could use her shed as an example for a workshop they ran each fall on fuelwood storage. Wren said that was fine, so long as nobody made too big a fuss about it. A month later, a short piece ran in the county paper anyway, with a photograph of Wren standing in front of the shed, dirt on her boots, arms crossed, looking faintly embarrassed by the whole thing. The headline called her a young homesteader with old-fashioned know-how. Wren thought the wording was a little much, but she kept the clipping anyway, tucked into the same drawer where Edette kept her pamphlets. Edette liked to tell people afterward that she hadn't taught her granddaughter anything Wren couldn't have found on her own, given enough patience and enough afternoons spent quietly reading. She said the pamphlets had been sitting in that drawer for decades, available to anyone in the family who cared to open them, and that the only thing Wren had actually needed from her was permission to take an old idea seriously, instead of assuming it was outdated simply because it was old. There's a particular kind of knowledge that skips a generation or 2 and then reappears, not because it was lost, but because nobody needed it badly enough to go looking for it. For a long stretch of years, nobody in the Costello family had needed to think hard about how a woodshed ought to be built, because there had always been a shed already standing, already doing its job well enough. It took losing her spot in that shed, being pushed out to the fence line with nothing but a tarp between her wood and the weather, for Wren to go looking for knowledge that had been sitting quietly in a kitchen drawer the whole time, waiting for someone who actually needed it. By March, when the last of the snow was finally giving way to mud season and the whole valley smelled like thaw, Wren had already started planning an addition, a second bay built the same way, oriented the same way, big enough to keep both her grandmother and her uncle stocked through whatever the next winter decided to throw at them. Wendell was helping her figure the math on rafters. Dale was saving locust rounds instead of splitting them, setting them aside for posts. Edette was still reading her pamphlets every morning with her coffee, the same as she always had, only now she had someone asking her questions about them again, which she admitted, if anyone pushed her on it, was worth more to her than the firewood ever was. The naturalist and philosopher Aldo Leopold once wrote that there are 2 spiritual dangers in not owning a farm, one being the belief that heat comes from the furnace, and the other being the belief that food comes from the grocery store, and that a woodpile teaches a person, better than almost anything else, exactly where warmth actually comes from and what it costs to earn it. Wren Costello learned that lesson at 12 years old. Not because anyone sat her down and explained it, but because she was forced out of a shed that had never really been hers to begin with, and she went looking for a way to build one that was. What she built that fall was a woodshed. What she earned that winter was something harder to put a name to: the particular quiet confidence of a person who has solved a real problem with her own hands, using materials other people had already decided were worthless, guided by knowledge other people had already decided was outdated. It wasn't the wood that mattered most in the end, dry as it stayed through the worst winter that valley had seen in years. It was the fact that a 12-year-old girl, told there was no room for her, went out and made room, quietly, without complaint, and without asking anyone's permission to be right.